The mahogany conference table gleamed under fluorescent lights as Preston Hale, CEO of Pinnacle Industries, slammed his leather portfolio shut. His cold blue eyes locked onto the black woman quietly organizing cleaning supplies in the corner of the executive boardroom. "Excuse me," his voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "This is a private meeting space. Whatever mess you're here to clean up can wait until after business hours." Nia Brooks looked up from her cart, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the dismissive tone. She wore simple navy work clothes and carried herself with quiet dignity. "I understand, sir. I was just finishing up." But Preston wasn't finished. "And next time, knock before entering executive spaces. You people need to learn boundaries." The words hung in the air like poison as Nia's hands stilled on the cleaning cloth. What Preston didn't know was that the woman he'd just insulted owned 68% of the company he thought he controlled. Before we dive in, this is Chains Broken, where we honor those who refuse to be silenced. If you believe courage deserves to be remembered, subscribe now and carry their legacy forward. Preston adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a gesture that spoke of inherited privilege and unearned confidence. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp shadows across his angular face. At 45, he had spent his entire career climbing corporate ladders, built by his father's connections, never questioning whether he deserved the view from the top. "Are you deaf?" His voice rose an octave, the kind of tone reserved for people he considered beneath his notice. "I said this area is restricted during executive hours. The service elevators are in the back of the building where maintenance staff belong." Nia's fingers tightened slightly around that hickel fiber cloth, but her expression remained calm. She had learned long ago that dignity was a choice, not a privilege granted by others. "I apologize for any inconvenience, Mr. Hale. I'll be out of your way shortly." The use of his name seemed to irritate him further. Preston stepped closer, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. "How do you know my name? Have you been eavesdropping on confidential meetings?" "Your nameplate is on the door, sir." The simple logic of her answer only fueled his indignation. In Preston's world, service workers were supposed to be invisible, nameless extensions of the machinery that kept his comfortable life running smoothly. The fact that this woman noticed details, spoke with quiet intelligence, and refused to cower disrupted his carefully constructed hierarchy. "Let me make something crystal clear," Preston said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This company operates on respect for authority and proper protocols. When executives are conducting business, the cleaning staff waits. When we're finished, you can scrub whatever needs scrubbing. Those are the rules that keep this place civilized." Nia nodded once, gathering her supplies with efficient movements. She had worked in corporate environments long enough to recognize the type men who confused positional authority with personal worth, who needed to diminish others to feel powerful themselves. What Preston couldn't see was the steel beneath her professional exterior, forged by years of navigating spaces where her competence was constantly questioned and her presence barely tolerated. "I understand completely, Mr. Hale," she said, pushing her cart toward the door. "Have a productive meeting." As she moved past him, Preston caught a whiff of expensive perfume that seemed incongruous with her uniform. For a split second, something flickered in his consciousness. A question mark in the neat categories he used to organize the world. But the moment passed quickly, swallowed by his certainty that he had successfully established the natural order of things. The boardroom door closed behind Nia with a soft click, leaving Preston alone with his assumptions and the faint echo of dignity that lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge. 20 minutes later, the executive conference room, filled with the calculated energy of corporate predators gathering for their weekly territory marking. Preston sat at the head of the mahogany table, his confidence restored by the familiar ritual of morning domination. The leather chairs creaked softly as 5 senior executives arranged their portfolios and activated their tablets. "Gentlemen," Preston began, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to being heard without question. "Before we dive into quarterly projections, I want to address something that happened this morning. A perfect example of how standards have slipped in this building. Preston Locke, the vice president of operations, leaned forward with the eager attention of a lieutenant anticipating orders. At 38, he had built his career by amplifying Preston Hale's opinions and making himself indispensable through unwavering loyalty. What kind of issue are we talking about? The kind that happens when you let these people think they can wander wherever they please, Preston said, his tone shifting to the casual racism that felt natural in rooms where he assumed everyone shared his prejudices. I found one of the cleaning crew in here this morning, acting like she belonged in an executive meeting space. The other executives exchanged glances, some uncomfortable, others calculating the political winds. Marcus Thornfield, the chief financial officer, cleared his throat nervously. Maybe she was just doing her job. Preston, sometimes the cleaning schedules overlap with Marcus, please. Preston's interruption carried the patronizing weight of someone explaining basic reality to a child. This wasn't about cleaning schedules. This was about boundaries, about respect, about understanding that there's a natural hierarchy that keeps businesses functioning properly. Preston Locke nodded enthusiastically, recognizing his cue. Absolutely. These affirmative action hires never learned proper workplace etiquette. They think being handed a job means they can ignore basic respect for authority. A ripple of nervous laughter moved around the table, the kind of sound that happens when people abandon their moral compass for the comfort of belonging. Even those who felt uneasy found themselves smiling, caught between principle and the primal need for acceptance in their professional pack. Exactly, Preston Hale continued, emboldened by the response. And the attitude was unbelievable. No yes sir, no proper deference. Just this quiet arrogance, like she was doing me a favor by acknowledging my authority in my own building. They never learn their place, added Preston Locke, his voice gaining momentum. Give them an inch of employment, and they think they own the whole company. The laughter grew louder this time, feeding on itself like a fire consuming oxygen. Robert Chen, the head of legal, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent, calculating the career cost of speaking up against the room's ugly energy. The worst part, Preston Hale said, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a storyteller who had found his audience, was how she acted like she belonged here, walking around like she had some kind of authority. These people never understand that there are invisible lines in society, and crossing them has consequences. David Kim, the newest executive, forced a smile while his stomach churned with recognition. He remembered being the only Asian face in rooms like this, remembered the coded language that excluded while maintaining plausible deniability. But mortgage payments and children's college funds had taught him the art of selective deafness. Next time something like this happens, Preston Locke suggested with the enthusiasm of someone proposing a solution to a shared problem, we should make it clear that certain areas of the building are simply off limits during business hours. Maybe add some additional supervision to the cleaning contracts. Preston Hale nodded approvingly. Good thinking. We can't have the staff forgetting who pays their salaries and what their role is in maintaining professional standards. The meeting continued with quarterly reports and budget projections, but the real business had already been conducted. Lines had been drawn, loyalties confirmed, and moral compromises normalized through the ancient ritual of group mockery. None of the men in that room could have imagined that their casual cruelty had been directed at the woman who would soon hold their professional futures in her hands. Outside the conference room, the hidden security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing every word and gesture for systems that would soon transform their private prejudices into very public consequences. 2 hours later, Preston Hale's morning had devolved into a series of frustrating phone calls and budget disputes that left him searching for someone to blame when he spotted Nia Brooks wheeling her cart down the executive hallway, restocking supply closets with quiet efficiency. His earlier irritation reignited like a match touched to gasoline. "You again," he called out, his voice echoing off the polished marble walls. I thought I made it clear that this floor has restricted access during business hours. Nia looked up from organizing cleaning supplies, her expression remaining professionally neutral despite the aggressive tone. Good afternoon, Mr. Hale. I'm completing the weekly inventory and restocking as scheduled by facilities management. Scheduled by whom? Preston stepped closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of industrial-grade cleaning products. I don't recall authorizing any additional maintenance activities on the executive level. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Preston had learned early in his career that challenging someone's right to exist in a space was the quickest way to establish dominance. Make them prove they belonged. Make them justify their presence, and you automatically positioned yourself as the authority who granted or denied permission. The work order was issued by building management, Nia replied calmly, reaching into her uniform pocket to retrieve a folded piece of paper. I can show you the documentation if you'd like to verify. Preston's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected her to have paperwork, hadn't anticipated that she would meet his challenge with quiet competence, instead of defensive stammering. In his experience, service workers caught in unauthorized areas usually apologized profusely and disappeared quickly. Documentation can be forged, he said, his voice taking on the prosecutorial tone he used in hostile negotiations. What I want to see is your employee identification, your security clearance, and proof that you're actually authorized to be in this building. The demand was deliberately excessive, designed to humiliate rather than verify. Preston knew that most cleaning staff carried basic ID badges, not the kind of comprehensive credentials he was demanding. It was a power play disguised as a security measure. Nia's hand stilled on the supply cart handle. For the first time since their initial encounter, something shifted in her expression. Not fear or anger, but a kind of quiet recognition that the conversation had moved beyond reasonable professional interaction into something darker. Mr. Hale, she said carefully, I've been working in this building for several months. My credentials are on file with Human Resources, and my security clearance was processed through the standard background check system. That's not what I asked for. Preston's voice rose, carrying down the hallway where other employees had begun to slow their pace, drawn by the tension radiating from the confrontation. I asked to see your identification right now. I asked for proof that you're not some random person who wandered in off the street. The accusation was absurd on its face. Nia wore a building-issued uniform, carried official work orders, and operated with a kind of systematic efficiency that came from months of established routine. But absurdity wasn't the point. The point was to force her into the position of having to prove her right to exist in his world. Are you refusing to show identification when requested by a senior executive? Preston continued, sensing an opportunity to escalate. Because that sounds like insubordination to me. That sounds like someone who has something to hide. Several employees had stopped pretending to be busy, their conversations dying as they watched the confrontation unfold. Preston was aware of his audience and played to it, using their presence to amplify the pressure on Nia. Public humiliation was always more effective than private intimidation. Nia reached slowly into her pocket, retrieving a standard employee ID badge attached to a retractable cord. She held it out for Preston to examine, her movements deliberate and non-threatening, despite the hostile environment he had created. Preston snatched the badge from her hand, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. The photograph showed Nia's face. The building logo was clearly visible, and the electronic chip gleamed under the hallway's fluorescent lights. Everything was legitimate, official, and exactly what any reasonable person would expect from a building employee. But reason had nothing to do with what was happening. Preston was performing dominance for an audience, demonstrating his ability to stop, question, and demand compliance from people he considered beneath his notice. The validity of her credentials was irrelevant. The power to demand them was everything. This could be fake, he said finally, holding the badge up to the light as if searching for counterfeit security features. Corporate espionage is a real threat in today's business environment. People use cleaning uniforms as cover to access sensitive areas, and steal proprietary information. The accusation was so disconnected from reality that several watching employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. But Preston had committed himself to this performance and couldn't back down without losing face in front of his subordinates. "You know what I think?" Preston continued, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme. "I think we have a serious security breach on our hands. I think someone who doesn't belong in a professional environment has been using affirmative action loopholes to gain access to sensitive corporate spaces." The words hit the hallway like a physical blow. Several employees looked away, suddenly finding their phones or paperwork intensely interesting. Others stared in shocked recognition that their CEO had just crossed a line from professional harassment into explicitly racial territory. Nia's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the cart handle, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Hale, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting," Preston said, his tone taking on the patient condescension of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child, "that there are certain standards of professionalism and competence that built this company. Standards that don't get lowered just because the government decided businesses need to fill diversity quotas." Preston Locke appeared at the end of the hallway, drawn by the commotion like a shark, sensing blood in the water. He approached with the eager stride of someone anticipating entertainment, his eyes bright with the prospect of witnessing his mentor deliver another lesson in corporate hierarchy. "Problem here, Preston?" Locke asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and approved of whatever was happening. "Just addressing some security concerns," Preston Hale replied, playing to his lieutenant's presence, "making sure our building access protocols are being followed by people who might not understand the importance of respecting professional boundaries." Locke's smile widened as he caught the coded language. "Ah yes, those diversity initiatives can be challenging to implement properly. Sometimes people mistake opportunity for entitlement." The two men shared a look of understanding that excluded everyone else in the hallway. A moment of communication that confirmed their shared worldview without requiring explicit statements. They were speaking in the dialect of plausible deniability, using corporate-friendly language to express ideas that would be unacceptable if stated directly. "Exactly." Preston Hale nodded. "When you give certain people access to spaces they've never earned, they sometimes forget that access comes with responsibility. They forget that there's a difference between being allowed somewhere and actually belonging there." Nia stood perfectly still, her professional composure intact, despite the verbal assault designed to strip away her dignity. She had heard this language before, in different contexts, with different words, but always carrying the same message. "You are not welcome here. You do not deserve to be here. And your presence is a favor that can be revoked at any moment." "The way I see it," Preston Locke added, emboldened by his boss's approval, "is that some people never learn the difference between earning respect and demanding it. They think showing up in a uniform gives them the right to act like they own the place." Around them, the hallway had grown uncomfortably quiet. Employees pretended to focus on their work while stealing glances at the confrontation. Caught between moral discomfort and professional self-preservation, everyone understood what was happening, but no one was willing to risk their career by speaking up. "Here's what's gonna happen," Preston Hale announced, his voice carrying the finality of judgment. "I'm going to personally verify your employment status with human resources. I'm going to review your background check, your references, and your work history. And if I find even the smallest discrepancy, even the slightest indication that you're not qualified for the position you're holding, there will be consequences." The threat hung in the air like smoke, designed to intimidate through its vagueness rather than its specificity. Preston had learned that implied consequences were often more effective than explicit ones, leaving the target to imagine the worst possible outcomes. "And in the meantime," he continued, "I want you to understand that this building operates on mutual respect and professional standards. When executives are conducting business, maintenance staff wait. When we're moving through common areas, you step aside. When we're speaking, you listen. Those aren't suggestions, those are requirements. Nia nodded once, her movements controlled and deliberate. "I understand, Mr. Hale." "Good." Preston's smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of someone who believed he had successfully established the natural order. "I'm glad we could have this conversation. Sometimes these things need to be spelled out clearly to avoid future misunderstandings." As Preston and Locke walked away, their conversation continued, in lowered voices punctuated by occasional laughter. Behind them, Nia resumed her work with the same quiet efficiency she had maintained throughout the confrontation. But something had fundamentally shifted in the building's atmosphere. What none of them could have known was that Quentin Navarro, the head of building security, had been monitoring the hallway cameras from his office 3 floors below, watching every moment of the exchange with growing concern and taking careful notes about what he was witnessing. The next morning brought a thunderstorm that matched Preston Hale's mood as he stormed through the executive lobby, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble floors with the staccato rhythm of barely contained rage. The previous evening's board meeting had gone poorly, with several directors questioning his quarterly projections and suggesting the need for fresh leadership perspectives. When he spotted Nia Brooks organizing supplies near the executive elevator bank, his accumulated frustration found its target. "Unbelievable," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "Every time I turn around, there you are, lurking in places where you have no business being." Nia looked up from her inventory clipboard, her expression maintaining its characteristic calm professionalism. "Good morning, Mr. Hale. I'm conducting the monthly safety equipment inspection as required by building codes." "Safety equipment inspection?" Preston's voice dripped with sarcasm. "And I suppose you're qualified to determine what constitutes proper safety protocols in an executive environment." The question was rhetorical, designed to diminish rather than elicit information. Preston had reached the point where Nia's very presence felt like a personal affront, a challenge to his authority that needed to be decisively addressed. "The inspection covers fire extinguisher placement, emergency lighting, and exit rail accessibility," Nia replied evenly. "It's a standard monthly requirement for all commercial buildings." "Standard, according to whom?" Preston stepped closer, using his height advantage to create an intimidating physical presence. "Because what I see is someone who keeps finding excuses to be in areas where she doesn't belong, doing jobs that could be handled by people with appropriate qualifications." The accusation hung in the air, like an unsheathed blade. Around them, the morning bustle of arriving executives and administrative staff continued. But several people had begun to notice the confrontation developing near the elevators. "Mr. Hale," Nia said carefully, "I'm following the work orders provided by building management. If you have concerns about the inspection schedule, I'd suggest contacting—" "I'm talking to you," Preston interrupted, his voice rising to a level that commanded attention throughout the lobby. "I'm tired of excuses. I'm tired of attitude. And I'm especially tired of people who think they can question my authority in my own building." The words "my own building" carried particular venom, as if Nia's presence somehow violated his personal territory, rather than simply occupying shared commercial space. Preston had convinced himself that her quiet competence was actually insubordination, that her professional demeanor masked disrespect for his position. "I apologize if you feel I've been disrespectful," Nia replied, her tone remaining steady despite the escalating hostility. "That certainly wasn't my intention." "Your intention doesn't matter," Preston snapped. "What matters is understanding your place in this organization and acting accordingly. What matters is showing proper deference to the people who sign your paychecks and can end your employment with a single phone call." The threat was explicit now, no longer hidden behind corporate euphemisms or coded language. Preston had abandoned any pretense of professional conduct, revealing the raw exercise of power that had always lurked beneath his polished executive facade. Nia's grip tightened slightly on her clipboard, but she maintained her composure. "I understand, Mr. Hale. Do you?" Preston moved even closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne and feel the heat of his anger. "Because your behavior suggests otherwise." Your behavior suggests that you think this is some kind of negotiation between equals." Around them, the lobby had grown noticeably quieter as conversations died and attention focused on the confrontation. Several employees pulled out phones, ostensibly checking messages, but actually positioning themselves to record what was rapidly becoming a public spectacle. "Let me make this crystal clear," Preston continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried more threat than shouting. "You work for me. Your job exists at my discretion. Your presence in this building is a privilege I can revoke at any time." As he spoke, Preston reached out and grabbed Nia's upper arm, his fingers tightening around her uniform sleeve in a gesture that crossed definitively from verbal harassment into physical assault. The contact was brief but unmistakable, a demonstration of dominance that said he could touch her, move her, control her physical space whenever he chose. "And when I tell you to stay out of certain areas," he continued, his grip tightening, "that's not a suggestion you can ignore or a rule you can interpret however you want. That's a direct order from someone who has the power to destroy your life if you continue to test my patience." The moment stretched like a held breath, Preston's hand on her arm, serving as a physical punctuation to his verbal assault. Around them, shocked murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd as employees realized they were witnessing their CEO physically manhandling a member of the staff. Nia looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up to meet his eyes, with a steadiness that somehow made him feel exposed, rather than powerful. "Mr. Hale," she said quietly, "I think you should remove your hand." The request was calm, professional, and somehow more commanding than any shout could have been. For a split second, Preston felt something shift in the dynamic. A moment of uncertainty where he wasn't sure who held the real authority in this confrontation. But the moment passed quickly, swallowed by his rage and the momentum of his public performance. Instead of releasing her arm, he tightened his grip and used it to push her backward toward the wall. "I think you should learn to keep your mouth shut when your betters are speaking," he snarled, pressing her against the cold marble surface. "I think you should remember that there are consequences for people who forget their place." The assault was now undeniable, witnessed by dozens of employees and captured by security cameras throughout the lobby. Preston had crossed every line of professional conduct and legal behavior, but in his fury, he remained convinced that he was simply establishing proper workplace hierarchy. 3 floors above the lobby confrontation, Quentin Navarro sat in the building's security control room, his eyes fixed on multiple monitors displaying camera feeds from throughout the executive floors. As head of building security, he had been tracking the escalating situation between Preston Hale and Nia Brooks for several days, growing increasingly concerned about the pattern of harassment he was witnessing. When Preston grabbed Nia's arm and pushed her against the wall, Quentin's training kicked in immediately. His fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating the relevant camera angles and initiating the high-definition recording protocol reserved for incidents requiring legal documentation. "Jesus," he muttered, watching Preston's assault unfold in real time across multiple screens. The cameras captured everything: the aggressive approach, the verbal threats, the physical contact, and the shocked reactions of witnessing employees. "This idiot has no idea what he just did." Quentin had worked building security for 15 years, long enough to recognize when powerful people made career-ending mistakes. But this was beyond a mistake. This was a federal civil rights violation happening in broad daylight, recorded from 6 different angles with crystal-clear audio. He immediately activated the secure backup protocol, ensuring that copies of the footage were automatically transmitted to off-site servers, beyond the reach of corporate interference. Then he picked up his phone and dialed the direct line for Detective Nora Finley, the FBI civil rights investigator he had worked with on previous cases involving workplace discrimination. Meanwhile, in the lobby, Preston finally released Nia's arm and stepped back, suddenly aware of the crowd that had gathered around them. The adrenaline of his rage began to fade, replaced by the first cold fingers of recognition that he might have gone too far in such a public setting. "Everyone back to work," he announced loudly, his voice carrying the forced authority of someone trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his management. This was a private personnel matter that doesn't concern anyone else. But the employees who had witnessed the assault weren't moving. They stood frozen in a mixture of shock and disbelief, their phones still pointed toward the scene like accusatory fingers. Several were openly recording, their video files already uploading to social media platforms where they would soon ignite viral outrage. Sarah Mitchell, a junior marketing coordinator, held her phone steady as she captured Preston's attempt at damage control. She had watched the entire confrontation unfold, seen the progression from verbal harassment to physical assault, and knew that what she had witnessed needed to be documented and shared. "Did you all hear me?" Preston's voice rose again, edged with desperation masked as authority. "I said get back to work. This is none of your business." But Marcus Webb, Preston's usual ally, approached with obvious nervousness written across his features. As head of human resources, he understood the legal implications of what had just happened better than anyone in the building. "Preston," he said quietly, pulling his boss aside, "we need to talk about this situation immediately. There are protocols we need to follow when there's been a workplace incident." "There was no incident," Preston snapped, his voice carrying the brittle edge of someone denying obvious reality. "There was a conversation about workplace standards that got slightly heated. That's all." Webb glanced meaningfully at the phones still recording around them, at the employees whispering among themselves, at Nia standing calmly against the wall with finger-shaped marks still visible on her uniform sleeve. "Preston, there were witnesses. There are cameras. We need to get ahead of this before what?" Preston's interruption was sharp with panic. He was trying to disguise as indignation. "Before people start spreading rumors and taking things out of context? Before the liberal media decides to manufacture another scandal." But even as he spoke, Preston could feel the situation slipping away from him. The employees weren't dispersing. The phones weren't being put away, and Nia Brooks continued to stand there, with that same calm dignity that had irritated him from their first encounter, somehow looking more powerful in her restraint than he had in his aggression. Quentin Navarro appeared in the lobby, with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to handle crises. He approached Nia directly, his security badge visible and his manner professionally concerned. "Ma'am, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" His questions were loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, establishing an official record of concern for her welfare. "I'm fine, thank you," Nia replied, her voice steady but grateful for the intervention. "I'll need you to file an incident report about what just occurred," Quentin continued, pulling out an official form that legitimized her complaint before Preston could pressure her into silence. Standard protocol for any workplace physical contact. Preston's face flushed red as he realized that his assault was being officially documented, despite his attempts to minimize it. "Now wait just a minute. There's no need for incident reports over a simple misunderstanding." "Sir," Quentin interrupted, his tone respectful but firm. "Physical contact between management and staff requires documentation regardless of the circumstances. It's company policy designed to protect everyone involved." The word policy hung in the air like a steel trap closing. Preston had spent his career hiding behind policies when they served his interests, but now found himself caught by the same bureaucratic machinery he had once wielded against others. As Nia filled out the incident report with Quentin's assistance, Preston realized that his moment of rage had just been transformed into an official record that would follow him through whatever came next. The cameras had captured everything, the witnesses had recorded everything, and now the company's own policies were being used to document his assault. For the first time since the confrontation began, Preston Hale felt genuinely afraid. Within 30 minutes of the lobby incident, word had spread through the executive floors like wildfire. In the mahogany-paneled conference room where it all began, Preston Locke paced nervously, while David Kim sat rigid in his chair, both men grappling with the implications of their boss's public meltdown. "This is a disaster," Kim muttered, scrolling through social media feeds where videos of the assault were already accumulating thousands of views and increasingly angry comments. The hashtags are trending. Pinnacle racism, CEO assault, Justice Fornia. This is going viral. Preston Locke stopped pacing and turned toward his colleague, with the expression of someone who had just found a scapegoat for his anxiety. You know what the real disaster is? It's that we're all going to pay the price. Because Preston couldn't control himself around one cleaning lady who got too uppity for her own good. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, revealing the true nature of Locke's thinking. In his mind, the problem wasn't the assault. It was that Preston Hale had been caught on camera, doing what Locke believed was sometimes necessary to maintain proper workplace hierarchy. What are you saying? Kim asked carefully, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. I'm saying that sometimes these people need to be reminded of their place, Locke replied, his voice gaining confidence as he warmed to his theme. I'm saying that affirmative action and diversity hiring have created a generation of employees who don't understand basic respect for authority. Kim's stomach churned as he listened to his colleague's racist rationalization, but years of corporate conditioning had taught him the art of strategic silence. He said nothing, which Locke interpreted as agreement. The truth is, Locke continued, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was speaking uncomfortable facts. Preston did what half the executives in this building have wanted to do for months. That woman has been walking around here like she owns the place, acting like she's equal to people who actually earned their positions. Robert Chen, the head of legal, entered the conference room with the grim expression of someone carrying bad news. His tablet was loaded with incident reports, witness statements and preliminary legal assessments that painted a picture of corporate liability extending far beyond a single moment of violence. Gentlemen, Chen said, his voice tight with professional concern, we have a serious problem. The security footage is comprehensive, the witness testimonies are consistent, and the physical evidence is undeniable. Preston committed assault in full view of dozens of employees and multiple cameras. Alleged assault, Locke corrected automatically, falling back on the legal semantics he hoped might provide some protection. And in the context of a workplace disciplinary situation that got out of hand, Chen's expression darkened. Preston, there's no alleged about grabbing someone by the arm and shoving them against a wall. That's battery under state law and civil rights violation under federal statute. And calling it workplace discipline makes it worse, not better. Look, Locke said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he used when trying to convince himself as much as others. Everyone knows that diversity hires sometimes need stronger management than traditional employees. Everyone knows that some people interpret professional courtesy as weakness and push boundaries until someone pushes back. Kim shifted uncomfortably in his seat, finally finding the courage to speak. Preston, what you're describing is exactly the kind of discriminatory thinking that's going to destroy this company. If investigators find evidence of systematic bias. Systematic bias? Locke's interruption was sharp with indignation. David, that's liberal buzzword nonsense. What we have is a culture clash between people who understand professional standards and people who were handed opportunities they didn't earn. Chen looked up from his tablet, with the expression of someone who had just heard a confession to additional crimes. Preston, I need you to understand something very clearly. If you continue talking like this, you're going to create evidence of conspiracy and discriminatory animus that will be used against this company in court. I'm talking about reality, Locke replied, his voice rising with the defensive anger of someone whose worldview was being challenged. I'm talking about what happens when you lower standards to meet diversity quotas instead of requiring diverse candidates to meet existing standards. That's enough. Chen's voice carried the authority of someone who knew they were witnessing career suicide in real time. Preston, I'm ordering you to stop talking about this incident immediately. Anything you say can and will be used as evidence of the company's discriminatory culture. But Locke was beyond the reach of legal advice, driven by a combination of panic and ideological certainty that made him incapable of recognizing his own danger. You know what I think? I think this whole situation is being blown out of proportion because she's black. I think if Preston had grabbed the arm of some white guy who was acting unprofessionally, nobody would care. The words fell into the room like grenades, exploding Chen's hopes of containing the legal damage and confirming Kim's worst fears about his colleague's character. In trying to defend his boss's actions, Locke had just provided prosecutors with a perfect example of the racist mindset that motivated the assault. Chen closed his tablet and stood up with the mechanical movements of someone in shock. "Gentlemen, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that last statement. I'm going to pretend you didn't just provide a textbook example of discriminatory animus, and I'm going to strongly suggest that you both contact personal attorneys immediately." As Chen left the conference room, Kim and Locke sat in uncomfortable silence, both beginning to understand that their careers at Pinnacle Industries were ending not because of Preston Hale's momentary loss of control, but because of their own fundamental inability to recognize that their racist assumptions were morally wrong and legally indefensible. At exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, the polished marble lobby of Pinnacle Industries became a stage for the kind of legal theater that changes corporate cultures overnight. Reginald Baxter emerged from the executive elevator, carrying a leather briefcase that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and wearing the kind of custom-tailored suit that announced serious professional authority. At 62, Baxter had built his reputation, representing clients whose cases redefined workplace law and civil rights jurisprudence. His silver hair was perfectly styled. His gold watch caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and his presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the vicinity. "Excuse me," he said to the receptionist, his voice carrying the cultured authority of someone accustomed to being heard without repetition. "I'm here to see Mr. Preston Hale regarding an incident involving my client, Miss Nia Brooks." The receptionist's eyes widened as she recognized the implications of an attorney appearing unannounced to discuss that morning's viral assault. Let me call upstairs and see if Mr. Hale is available." "Mr. Hale will make himself available," Baxter replied with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that refusing to meet with him would only make his client's eventual lawsuit more expensive. "Please inform him that I'm here to discuss a time-sensitive legal matter that requires his immediate attention." Within minutes, Preston Hale appeared in the lobby, flanked by Robert Chen and 2 other corporate attorneys who had been hastily summoned to deal with the crisis. Preston's usual confidence had been replaced by the tight-lipped anxiety of someone who knew he was walking into a minefield. "Mr. Baxter," Chen said, stepping forward to intercept the encounter, "I'm Robert Chen, head of legal for Pinnacle Industries. Perhaps we could discuss this matter in private conference room, rather than—" "Mr. Chen," Baxter interrupted smoothly, "I appreciate your concern for your client's privacy, but this matter is no longer private. My client was assaulted by your CEO in full view of dozens of witnesses and multiple security cameras. The time for private discussions ended when Mr. Hale decided to use physical violence against a woman whose only crime was doing her job professionally." The words hit the lobby like hammer blows, each sentence precisely crafted to establish the legal reality that Preston's assault had created. Around them, employees who had gathered to witness the confrontation began pulling out phones to record this new development in the unfolding drama. Preston stepped forward with the defensive aggression of someone trying to regain control of a narrative that was rapidly escaping his management. "Now wait just a minute. There seems to be some misunderstanding about what happened this morning. What occurred was a minor workplace disagreement that got slightly heated, nothing more." Baxter's smile was as sharp as surgical steel. "Mr. Hale, I have security footage from 6 different angles showing you grabbing my client's arm and physically forcing her against a wall while making racist threats about her employment. I have witness statements from 17 employees who heard your discriminatory comments. I have medical documentation of the physical evidence your assault left on her arm." Preston's face went pale as the comprehensive scope of the evidence was laid out like cards on a table. He had somehow convinced himself that he could control the narrative, minimize the incident, and avoid serious consequences through the same corporate maneuvering that had protected him throughout his career. "Furthermore," Baxter continued, his voice gaining momentum, I have evidence that this morning's assault was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a pattern of racially motivated harassment that my client has endured for several weeks while documenting your behavior." The lobby fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. If Nia had been documenting Preston's harassment, it meant she had anticipated this escalation and prepared accordingly. It meant that everything Preston thought was spontaneous workplace discipline was actually recorded evidence of deliberate discrimination. Chen stepped forward desperately. "Mr. Baxter, surely we can resolve this matter through mediation rather than—" "Mr. Chen." Baxter's interruption was sharp with finality. "My client was physically assaulted by your CEO while conducting her professional duties. This is not a matter for mediation. This is a matter for criminal prosecution and federal civil rights litigation." Preston's legs felt weak as the reality of criminal charges began to penetrate his consciousness. Throughout his career, he had operated under the assumption that corporate executives were insulated from serious legal consequences by armies of lawyers and favorable legal precedents. The idea that he might face actual jail time had never seriously occurred to him. "What exactly are you seeking?" Chen asked, his voice tight with the recognition that his client's position was legally indefensible. Baxter opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder that seemed to contain enough documentation to bury Preston's career permanently. "What I'm seeking, Mr. Chen, is accountability. What I'm seeking is justice for a woman who was targeted for abuse because of her race and then assaulted when she maintained her dignity in the face of that abuse." He handed Chen a document that made the corporate attorney's face go ashen. "That's a formal complaint, filing with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, documenting systematic racial harassment. That's a criminal complaint, with the district attorney's office detailing the assault. And that's notice of intent to file federal civil rights litigation under Section—" Preston grabbed Chen's arm to look at the documents, his hands shaking as he realized that his moment of rage had triggered a legal avalanche that would destroy everything he had spent his career building. The papers in his hands represented not just personal consequences, but the complete exposure of his character to public scrutiny. This was just— Preston's voice trailed off as he searched for words that might somehow undo the morning's events. But there were no words that could erase security footage, no explanations that could justify assault, no corporate procedures that could protect him from the consequences of his actions. Baxter's expression remained professionally neutral as he watched Preston's world crumble. "Mr. Hale, my client gave you multiple opportunities to treat her with basic human dignity. She responded to your harassment with patience and professionalism. She conducted herself with grace even when you subjected her to racist abuse. But when you decided to put your hands on her, you crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." The lawyer's words carried the weight of judgment and the promise of consequences that would extend far beyond the marble lobby where Preston's career had just ended. As employees continued recording the confrontation, as social media amplified the story to national attention, and as law enforcement prepared to investigate, Preston Hale finally understood that his actions had consequences he could neither control nor escape. Detective Nora Finley arrived at Pinnacle Industries at 4:17 p.m., her FBI credentials cutting through corporate bureaucracy like a blade through silk. At 41, she had spent 15 years investigating civil rights violations in corporate America, developing a reputation for methodical evidence gathering that made defense attorneys nervous and corporate executives sleepless. Her first stop was Quentin Navarro's security office, where she knew the digital evidence that would make or break the case was waiting for her review. The security chief had worked with federal investigators before and understood the importance of preserving evidence chains that would hold up under the scrutiny of both criminal and civil proceedings. "Detective Finley," Quentin said, rising from his desk as she entered the climate-controlled server room that housed Pinnacle's surveillance systems. "I've isolated all relevant footage and maintained complete digital integrity protocols. Everything you need to see is queued up and ready for federal seizure." "Talk me through what you captured," Finley said, settling into a chair facing the array of monitors that displayed camera feeds from throughout the building. Her notebook was already open, her pen ready to document what she suspected would be compelling evidence of federal civil rights violations. Quentin's fingers moved across the keyboard, with practiced efficiency, calling up footage from the morning's assault. We have 6 different angles of the primary incident, plus comprehensive documentation of the escalating harassment pattern over the past 3 weeks. The first video began playing, showing Preston Hale's initial confrontation with Nia Brooks in the executive boardroom. Finley watched with the analytical eye of someone trained to recognize the behavioral patterns that indicated racial animus rather than legitimate workplace concerns. "Notice the language patterns," Quentin narrated, pointing to specific moments in the footage. "He's not addressing performance issues or specific behaviors. He's challenging her right to exist in the space. Watch his body language. This is dominance assertion, not professional supervision." Finley nodded, making detailed notes about Preston's aggressive posturing, his dismissive gestures, and the coded racist language that federal prosecutors would later use to establish discriminatory intent. "What about audio quality?" "Crystal clear," Quentin replied, advancing to footage from the hallway confrontation. "Our system captures conversation from 30 feet away. You'll hear every word of his escalation from professional harassment to explicit racial targeting." The second video showed Preston's demand for Nia's credentials, his accusations of corporate espionage, and his inflammatory comments about diversity quotas and professional standards. Finley's pen moved rapidly across her notebook as she documented each statement that would later be dissected by legal experts. "And here's where it becomes criminal," Quentin said, cueing up the lobby assault footage. "Multiple angles, perfect lighting, comprehensive audio. There's no ambiguity about what happens next." The assault unfolded across 6 screens, simultaneously, showing Preston's physical grab, Nia's attempted de-escalation, and his decision to push her against the wall while making explicit threats about her employment. Finley had seen hundreds of assault videos during her career, but the combination of racial animus and physical violence captured here would make this case a textbook example of federal civil rights violations. The perpetrator had no idea about the comprehensive surveillance, Finley observed, making note of Preston's obvious shock when Quentin arrived to document the incident. He thought he could control the narrative. "There's more," Quentin said, his voice carrying a mixture of professional satisfaction and moral outrage. "I've been monitoring the executive floor communications since the initial harassment began. We have recordings of planning meetings where other executives discussed strategies for targeting Ms. Brooks." Finley looked up sharply from her notes. "Conspiracy evidence. Listen to this," Quentin said, playing audio from the conference room where Preston Locke and David Kim had discussed their racist rationales for the harassment. The recording captured Locke's explicit statements about diversity hires needing stronger management, and his belief that Nia was acting like she owns the place. "That's conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal statute," Finley said, her voice tight with professional excitement. "That's systematic discriminatory animus documented in real time. Defense attorneys are going to have nightmares about this evidence." Quentin leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Detective, there's something else you need to know. Something that's going to change the entire scope of this investigation." "What do you mean?" "Ms. Brooks isn't just a cleaning employee," Quentin said carefully. "I've been running background checks as part of my security protocols, and her true identity is going to shock everyone involved in this case." Finley's pen stopped moving across her notebook. "Explain." "According to corporate filings I accessed this afternoon, Ms. Nia Brooks is the beneficial owner of 68% of Pinnacle Industries. She purchased controlling interest through a blind trust 3 months ago. Preston Hale has been physically assaulting and racially harassing the woman who owns the company he thinks he runs." The silence in the security office was profound, as the implications of that revelation settled into Finley's consciousness. She had investigated hundreds of workplace discrimination cases, but none where the victim held ultimate authority over her abuser's professional futures. "Are you certain about this?" she asked finally. Quentin turned his monitor toward her, displaying corporate ownership documents, SEC filings, and trust agreements that confirmed Nia Brooks' controlling stake in Pinnacle Industries. The documentation is comprehensive and legally binding. She's not just the victim here, she's the boss. The Pinnacle Industries boardroom had never hosted a meeting quite like the one that convened at 6:30 p.m. that evening. Preston Hale sat at what he still believed was his position at the head of the mahogany table, flanked by his corporate attorneys and the executives who had participated in or witnessed the morning's assault. The atmosphere was thick with tension and barely controlled panic. "Gentlemen," Robert Chen began, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver catastrophic news. "We've received additional information about Ms. Brooks that fundamentally changes our legal exposure and corporate liability in this matter." Preston's face was already flushed with stress and anger, but Chen's ominous tone made his stomach clench with new anxiety. "What kind of additional information?" Before Chen could answer, the boardroom doors opened to admit Detective Finley, Reginald Baxter, and to everyone's shock, Nia Brooks herself. But the woman who entered the room bore little resemblance to the humble cleaning employee they thought they knew. Nia wore a perfectly tailored navy business suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her hair was styled with executive precision, and she carried herself with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to commanding corporate boardrooms. The transformation was so complete that several executives didn't immediately recognize her. "Good evening, gentlemen," Nia said, her voice carrying the same quiet dignity that had characterized her responses to Preston's harassment, but now amplified by the confidence of someone who no longer needed to hide her true position. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Preston stared at her in confusion, his brain struggling to process the cognitive dissonance between the woman he had been abusing and the executive authority figure standing before him. What is this? What's going on?" Reginald Baxter stepped forward, his leather briefcase containing documents that would redefine everyone's understanding of the power dynamics at Pinnacle Industries. "Mr. Hale, I'd like you to meet my client in her full capacity. This is Nia Brooks, majority shareholder and controlling owner of Pinnacle Industries." The words hit the boardroom like explosive charges, detonating Preston's worldview and leaving smoking craters where his assumptions used to exist. Around the table, executives sat in stunned silence as they processed the impossible reality that they had been witnessing their CEO racially harass and physically assault the woman who actually owned the company. That's impossible," Preston stammered, his voice weak with shock and disbelief. "She's a cleaning lady. She works for the maintenance department. I've seen her pushing carts and organizing supplies." "Yes, you have," Nia replied calmly, taking a seat at the conference table with the natural authority of someone claiming her rightful position. "For the past 3 months, I've been conducting undercover observations of corporate culture and management practices at the company I purchased. What I discovered exceeded my worst expectations about workplace discrimination and systemic racism." Detective Finley opened her notebook, her pen ready to document any admissions that might strengthen the federal case against Preston and his conspirators. "Ms. Brooks has been working with our Civil Rights Division to document patterns of discriminatory behavior that violate federal employment law." Preston's hands shook as the full scope of his situation became clear. He hadn't just assaulted a random employee. He had committed federal crimes against the woman who held ultimate authority over his career, his reputation, and his future. But why? Why would someone who owns a company work as a cleaning person? "Because," Nia said, her voice carrying the steel of someone who had endured weeks of racist abuse in service of exposing systemic discrimination. "I needed to understand the true culture of the organization I had acquired. I needed to see how management treated the most vulnerable employees when they thought no one important was watching." Preston Locke, who had been silent since Nia's entrance, finally found his voice. "This is entrapment. You can't set people up and then prosecute them for behavior you engineered." Baxter's laugh was sharp with legal certainty. "Mr. Locke, my client didn't engineer anything. She simply existed in a workplace while Blacken observed how your management team responded to her presence. The racist harassment, the discriminatory language, and the physical assault were entirely your choices. Around the table, executives who had witnessed or participated in Preston's harassment campaign began to understand that their careers were ending, not because they had been caught in a moment of poor judgment, but because their fundamental character had been revealed under what they thought were favorable circumstances. The undercover documentation is comprehensive, Detective Finley added, consulting her notes. We have 3 months of systematic evidence showing how this management team treats minority employees when they believe there are no consequences for discriminatory behavior. Preston slumped in his chair as the weight of his situation crushed his remaining denial. He had spent his career believing that his prejudices were shared and acceptable among people of his social class. The discovery that he had been exposing his racism to the woman who owned the company felt like a cosmic joke designed to destroy everything he thought he understood about power and privilege. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nia looked directly at him with the same calm dignity she had maintained throughout weeks of his abuse. Now, Mr. Hale, you face the consequences of your choices. You learn what accountability looks like when you can't hide behind corporate hierarchy or shared prejudice. The criminal charges proceed, Detective Finley added. The federal civil rights investigation continues, and Ms. Brooks will determine what corporate restructuring is necessary to address the discriminatory culture that enabled this systematic abuse. As the reality of his situation settled over Preston like a suffocating blanket, he finally understood that his moment of rage had revealed not just his character, but the character of an entire management structure that had operated under the assumption that their prejudices would never be exposed to meaningful scrutiny. The woman he had dismissed as beneath his notice had just demonstrated that true power comes not from position or privilege, but from dignity, preparation, and the courage to stand up for justice even when it requires personal sacrifice. The next morning brought a convoy of black SUVs to the Pinnacle Industries parking garage, their tinted windows reflecting the early sunlight like mirrors of judgment. Detective Nora Finley stepped out of the lead vehicle flanked by 6 additional FBI agents, each carrying the kind of equipment that indicated this was more than a routine investigation. Agent Marcus Webb emerged from the second vehicle with a briefcase full of search warrants and federal court orders that would transform Pinnacle Industries from a private corporation into a crime scene under active federal investigation. At 34, Webb specialized in corporate civil rights violations and had developed a reputation for methodical evidence gathering that made white-collar criminals pray for plea bargains. Remember, Finley addressed her team as they assembled in the parking garage, this isn't just about yesterday's assault. We're looking for evidence of systematic, discriminatory practices that created the culture where assault became acceptable. Check email servers, HR files, personnel records, and any documentation that shows pattern and practice. The lobby receptionist's face went pale as the federal agents approached her desk with the kind of professional authority that made corporate executives cancel their golf plans and call their personal attorneys. We need to speak with building management immediately, Finley announced, displaying her credentials. This building is now under federal investigation for civil rights violations. Within minutes, the executive floors were buzzing with panicked activity. As word spread that the FBI had arrived with search warrants, Preston Hale sat in his office, staring at the federal court orders that gave investigators access to his emails, his personnel files, and his phone records dating back 3 years. This can't be happening, he muttered to Robert Chen, who sat across from his desk, with the expression of someone watching a natural disaster unfold in slow motion. Federal investigations are for terrorists and organized crime, not for workplace disagreements that got out of hand. Chen's laugh was bitter with professional despair. Preston, you physically assaulted the majority owner of this company while making racist statements in front of dozens of witnesses. Federal civil rights investigators dream about cases this clear-cut. Agent Webb appeared in the doorway with 2 FBI technicians carrying equipment designed to image computer hard drives and preserve digital evidence. "Mr. Hale, I'm Agent Webb with the FBI Civil Rights Division. We'll need access to your computer, your phone, and any other electronic devices you use for business communication." Preston's hands trembled as he realized that years of emails containing language he had never expected to be scrutinized by federal prosecutors were about to be dissected by legal experts looking for evidence of discriminatory animus. "Do I need a lawyer for this?" "That's your constitutional right," Webb replied, with professional neutrality. "But the search warrants are valid, regardless of whether you choose to cooperate or invoke your right to counsel." Down the hall, Preston Locke was having his own encounter with federal authority as Agent Sarah Martinez went through his computer files with the kind of systematic thoroughness that made executives understand why white-collar crime prosecution had become a specialized field of law enforcement. "Mr. Locke," Martinez said, reading from an email thread she had discovered, "can you explain this message you sent to David Kim last month? Quote, we need to find ways to manage the diversity hires more aggressively. Some of these people think equal opportunity means equal authority." End quote. Locke's face flushed as he realized that his casual racism, which had felt comfortable and acceptable when shared among colleagues, now sounded like evidence of criminal conspiracy when read aloud by a federal investigator. That was just venting about workplace management challenges. It wasn't meant to be discriminatory. "What about this follow-up message?" Martinez continued. Quote, "Preston's right about maintaining standards. Sometimes you have to remind certain employees about the natural hierarchy that keeps businesses functioning. Can you clarify what you meant by natural hierarchy and certain employees?" The questions were designed to elicit admissions that would strengthen the federal case against him. Locke understood that anything he said could be used as evidence, but remaining silent felt like an admission of guilt that might make his situation worse. Meanwhile, in the building's server room, FBI computer specialists were imaging terabytes of data that would soon be analyzed by federal prosecutors, looking for patterns of discriminatory behavior across the entire corporate structure. Email metadata, personnel decisions, and internal communications were being preserved as evidence in what was rapidly becoming one of the most comprehensive civil rights investigations in corporate America. Detective Finley found herself in the Human Resources Department, reviewing personnel files with HR Director Marcus Thornfield, whose nervous energy suggested he understood that his department's policies were about to be scrutinized by federal experts in employment discrimination law. "Walk me through your hiring and promotion practices," Finley said, settling into a chair with her notebook ready. "Specifically, I want to understand how decisions get made about advancement opportunities for minority employees." Thornfield's hands shook as he opened filing cabinets that contained 3 years of personnel decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but might appear discriminatory under federal investigation. "We follow all applicable equal employment opportunity guidelines," he said weakly. "Then you won't mind explaining why your promotion rates for black employees are 37% below industry standards?" Finley replied, consulting statistics that had been compiled by FBI analysts. "And you won't mind explaining why disciplinary actions against minority employees are documented at twice the rate of similar actions against white employees." The data was damning, showing systematic disparities that suggested discriminatory policies rather than individual bias. Thornfield realized that his department's practices, which had operated under the assumption that subtle discrimination was legally acceptable, were about to be exposed as violations of federal civil rights law. Detective Thornfield said quietly, "If there have been disparities in our employment practices, they certainly weren't intentional. We've always tried to maintain fair and equitable policies for all employees." Finley looked up from her notes with the expression of someone who had heard that excuse countless times during her career. "Mr. Thornfield, intent is less important than impact under federal civil rights law, and the impact of your policies has been to create a workplace culture where assaulting a black woman seemed acceptable to your CEO." By noon, the FBI investigation had uncovered a digital treasure trove of evidence that painted Pinnacle Industries as a textbook example of institutional racism disguised as corporate professionalism. In a secure conference room 3 floors below the executive suites, Detective Finley and Agent Webb spread documents across a large table like archaeologists cataloging the artifacts of a corrupt civilization. "Look at this pattern," Webb said, pointing to a spreadsheet that tracked promotion decisions over the previous 3 years. Every time a black employee was recommended for advancement by their immediate supervisor, the recommendation was overruled by executive management with vague references to cultural fit and leadership potential. Finley studied the data with the analytical eye of someone trained to recognize discriminatory patterns in bureaucratic language. And notice how the documentation changes when Preston Hale became CEO 18 months ago. The language gets more coded, but the disparities become more pronounced. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications. Internal emails revealed a management culture where racist assumptions were shared freely, where discriminatory policies were implemented through euphemistic language, and where complaints about bias were systematically ignored or rationalized away. "Here's the smoking gun," Webb said, opening a laptop to display an email thread that would become central to the federal prosecution. "This is from Preston Locke to Preston Hale, sent 2 weeks ago. Quote, the Brooks situation is getting out of hand. She acts like she belongs in executive spaces. We need to establish clear boundaries about where these diversity hires can go and what they can do." End quote. The message was followed by Preston Hale's response. "Agreed. Sometimes you have to remind people of their place in the corporate hierarchy. Natural selection applies to business environments just like biological ones." Finley shook her head in amazement at the brazen nature of the discriminatory communication. They documented their own conspiracy. They created a paper trail of racial animus that defense attorneys will spend years trying to explain away. Agent Martinez entered the conference room carrying a box of printed emails that represented months of systematic discrimination disguised as corporate communication. "You need to see what I found in David Kim's files," she said, spreading additional documents across the table. He was keeping detailed records of what he called diversity management challenges. The records revealed that Kim had been documenting instances where minority employees were perceived as overstepping boundaries or failing to show appropriate respect for corporate hierarchy. Each incident was carefully cataloged with dates, witness names, and recommended corrective actions that ranged from informal counseling to termination recommendation. "This is conspiracy documentation," Webb observed, reading through Kim's meticulous notes about strategies for managing minority employees. He was treating civil rights violations like operational challenges that required systematic solution. The investigation had also uncovered audio recordings from executive meetings, where discriminatory policies were discussed in language that revealed the true mindset behind corporate decision-making. In one particularly damaging recording, Preston Hale could be heard explaining his philosophy about workplace diversity. "The problem with these affirmative action programs is that they put people in positions they haven't earned through traditional merit. When someone gets a job because of their race instead of their qualifications, they sometimes forget that they're guests in a professional environment that operates according to established standards." The recording continued with Preston Locke's enthusiastic agreement. "Exactly. And when guests forget their place, sometimes hosts have to remind them about appropriate behavior. That's not discrimination. That's basic social order." Finley paused the audio playback, her expression grim with professional outrage. They recorded themselves describing civil rights violations as social etiquette. They documented their own criminal intent while thinking they were having a private conversation about corporate management. Agent Webb gathered the evidence into organized files that would soon be presented to federal prosecutors as the foundation for criminal charges and civil rights litigation. "Detective, in 15 years of investigating corporate discrimination, I've never seen a case where the perpetrators documented their own criminal conspiracy so comprehensively." The scope of the evidence extended beyond individual bias to reveal systematic institutional discrimination that had operated under the assumption that subtle racism was legally acceptable as long as it was expressed in professional language. Personnel files showed that minority employees were consistently held to different standards, subjected to additional scrutiny, and excluded from advancement opportunities through policies that appeared neutral but functioned discriminatorily. What's particularly damning, Martinez added, reviewing termination records, is how they documented false justifications for firing minority employees who complained about discriminatory treatment. Look at this pattern. Every black employee who filed a bias complaint was terminated within 6 months for performance issues that weren't documented before they made their complaint. The investigation had also uncovered financial records showing that Pinnacle Industries had quietly settled multiple discrimination lawsuits over the previous 5 years, paying settlements with non-disclosure agreements that prevented public exposure of their discriminatory practices. The pattern suggested that corporate leadership had been aware of their legal liability, but chosen to treat discrimination complaints as business expenses rather than opportunities for cultural change. They were budgeting for discrimination, Finley observed, reviewing settlement agreements that totaled hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments to former employees. They calculated that paying off victims was cheaper than changing their corporate culture. As the federal investigation continued into the afternoon, the evidence mounted against Preston Hale, Preston Locke, and the entire executive structure that had enabled systematic discrimination, disguised as corporate professionalism. Phone records showed coordination between executives about strategies for managing diversity challenges. Email threads documented racist assumptions shared freely among management, and personnel records revealed discriminatory patterns that violated federal civil rights law. The culture of abuse that had culminated in Preston Hale's assault on Nia Brooks was now exposed as the inevitable result of institutional racism that had operated without accountability for years. What executives had believed was acceptable corporate behavior was being revealed as criminal conspiracy that would result in federal charges, civil rights litigation, and the complete destruction of careers built on discriminatory foundations. Detective Finley closed her notebook with the satisfaction of someone who had uncovered evidence that would deliver justice for systematic abuse, while sending a clear message that civil rights violations would face serious federal consequences regardless of corporate position or social privilege. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, the first viral video had already accumulated over 2 million views across social media platforms. Sarah Mitchell, the marketing coordinator who had recorded Preston's assault in the lobby, watched in amazement as her smartphone footage sparked a digital firestorm that was rapidly transforming a local incident into a national conversation about racism in corporate America. The video showed everything: Preston's aggressive approach, his racist language, the physical grab and shove against the wall, and Nia's dignified composure throughout the assault. But what made the footage particularly powerful was the audio quality that captured every word of Preston's discriminatory tirade, leaving no room for interpretation or corporate spin. Pinnacle assault was trending on Twitter within 2 hours, joined by CEO violence, corporate racism, and justice for Nia. The hashtags spread like wildfire, amplified by civil rights organizations, legal experts, and ordinary citizens who recognized the broader implications of what they were witnessing. Major news networks picked up the story by the evening news cycle, with legal analysts dissecting the footage frame by frame to explain how Preston's actions constituted both criminal assault and federal civil rights violations. CNN's legal correspondent provided expert commentary that reached millions of viewers. What we're seeing in this footage is a textbook example of how racist assumptions can escalate to physical violence when people in positions of power believe they can act without consequences. The perpetrator's language reveals deep-seated discriminatory beliefs that suggest this incident was not aberrant behavior, but the inevitable result of systematic bias. The story gained additional momentum when investigative journalists began digging into Pinnacle Industries' history, uncovering the settlement agreements and discrimination complaints that the FBI investigation had revealed. Corporate watchdog organizations shared internal documents that painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as business practices. Preston Hale sat in his corner office, watching his professional reputation disintegrate in real time across multiple screens. His assistant had stopped fielding phone calls from reporters after the 100th media inquiry, and his personal attorney had recommended complete silence while the criminal investigation proceeded. "This is a nightmare," he muttered to Robert Chen, who sat across from his desk with the expression of someone watching a client's career implode beyond any possibility of recovery. "These people are making me sound like some kind of monster when all I did was have a workplace disagreement that got slightly physical." Chen's laugh was hollow with legal despair. "Preston, you physically assaulted a black woman while making racist statements about her right to exist in your building. The fact that you still think this was a workplace disagreement is exactly why federal prosecutors are going to destroy you in court." The media coverage intensified when civil rights leaders began weighing in on the case, using Preston's assault as an example of how racism operates in corporate environments. Reverend Michael Thompson, president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, issued a statement that was widely quoted across news platforms. "The violence we witnessed at Pinnacle Industries represents the logical endpoint of systematic discrimination that treats Black Americans as unwelcome guests in spaces where they have every right to belong. When corporate executives feel comfortable expressing racist beliefs and using physical force to enforce racial hierarchies, we see the true face of institutional racism in America." Social media platforms became battlegrounds where users debated the broader implications of Preston's actions. Supporters of civil rights shared the video as evidence of ongoing workplace discrimination, while others attempted to defend Preston by claiming he was the victim of cancel culture and reverse racism. But the defenders' arguments crumbled under the weight of additional evidence that continued to emerge from the FBI investigation. When leaked emails revealed Preston's history of discriminatory language and his colleagues' conspiracy to target minority employees, even his most committed supporters began distancing themselves from his actions. Preston Locke watched his own career implode as social media users identified him as one of Preston's co-conspirators, sharing screenshots of his LinkedIn profile alongside quotes from his leaked emails about diversity management challenges. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications as former colleagues, clients, and industry contacts severed their professional relationships to avoid association with the scandal. "I'm being treated like a criminal," Locke complained to his wife during a phone call that was captured by FBI surveillance equipment. "All I did was support my boss when he tried to maintain professional standards in the workplace." The conversation, which would later be used as evidence of continuing racial animus, revealed how deeply Preston's co-conspirators had internalized their discriminatory beliefs. Even facing federal investigation and career destruction, they remained convinced that their actions were justified by racial hierarchies they considered natural and appropriate. Media coverage reached a new level of intensity when Nia Brooks's true identity was revealed through investigative reporting. Business journalists who specialized in corporate ownership discovered her controlling stake in Pinnacle Industries, transforming the story from workplace discrimination into a saga of power, deception, and ultimate justice. CEO assaults his own boss. The shocking truth behind corporate racism became the headline that defined the second wave of media coverage, as news outlets explored the unprecedented nature of a chief executive physically attacking the majority owner of his own company, while unaware of her identity. The revelation added layers of complexity to the story that fascinated viewers and readers across the country. Legal experts debated whether Nia's undercover investigation constituted entrapment, while business analysts discussed the implications of ownership structures that allowed systematic discrimination to flourish under executive leadership. Financial networks covered the story from an investor perspective, analyzing how the discrimination scandal would impact Pinnacle Industries' stock price, client relationships, and long-term viability. Market analysts predicted significant losses as corporate partners distanced themselves from a company whose leadership had been exposed as systematically racist. The Pinnacle Industries Board of Directors convened an emergency meeting at 8 p.m. that evening, their faces grim with the recognition that their company had become the center of a national scandal that threatened not only their reputations but their personal financial interests. The mahogany-paneled conference room that had once hosted routine corporate discussions now served as a crisis center where careers and fortunes hung in the balance. Board Chairman William Sterling called the meeting to order with the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. At 72, he had guided Pinnacle through various business challenges, but nothing in his corporate experience had prepared him for managing a scandal where the CEO had physically assaulted the majority owner while being recorded by federal investigators. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice carrying the weight of impending doom, "we are facing an existential crisis that threatens the survival of this corporation. The media coverage has been devastating, the federal investigation is expanding, and our stock price has dropped 37% in the past 6 hours." Around the table, board members who had once rubber-stamped Preston Hale's leadership decisions now faced the reality that their passive oversight had enabled systematic discrimination that was about to cost them millions of dollars in legal liability and market capitalization. "The immediate question," Sterling continued, "is whether we can contain this damage through executive leadership changes and corporate restructuring, or whether the discrimination culture is so deeply embedded that we're facing complete organizational collapse." Director Patricia Gonzalez, head of the Audit Committee, had spent the afternoon reviewing internal documents that revealed years of discriminatory practices disguised as business policies. "William, the FBI investigation has uncovered evidence that our executive team was systematically violating federal civil rights law while documenting their own criminal conspiracy. This isn't a containable public relations problem. This is a federal case that could result in criminal charges against multiple executives." The board had also received preliminary reports from external investigators who were reviewing Pinnacle's employment practices under federal court order. The findings painted a picture of institutional racism that extended far beyond Preston Hale's individual actions, revealing systematic disparities in hiring, promotion, compensation, and disciplinary practices that violated federal employment law. "What about the settlement agreements?" asked Director Robert Kim, reviewing financial records that showed hundreds of thousands of dollars in discrimination payments over the previous 5 years. "Did legal counsel adequately inform the board about our civil rights liability?" The question highlighted one of the most damaging aspects of the unfolding scandal: evidence that corporate leadership had been aware of discrimination complaints, but had chosen to treat them as business expenses rather than warnings about systematic legal violations. Internal documents showed that executives had calculated that paying settlements was cheaper than changing discriminatory practices. "According to the FBI investigation," Sterling replied, consulting notes from his conversation with federal prosecutors, "our legal department was actively facilitating discrimination by drafting non-disclosure agreements that prevented victims from exposing our illegal practices. We weren't just enabling discrimination, we were covering it up through legal mechanisms designed to avoid accountability." Director Janet Mitchell, who had served on corporate boards for 20 years, had never encountered a situation where a company's legal strategies had become evidence of criminal conspiracy. "Are we facing personal liability for enabling these practices through our board oversight?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence, as board members realized that their fiduciary responsibilities might have created criminal exposure when applied to systematic civil rights violations. Corporate insurance policies that protected directors from business liability might not cover criminal conspiracy to violate federal law. Sterling opened a leather folder containing preliminary assessments from crisis management specialists who had been retained to evaluate Pinnacle's options for corporate survival. The consulting reports are unanimous. Preston Hale and his executive team represent an existential threat to this corporation that can only be addressed through complete leadership restructuring and comprehensive policy reform. "What about Nia Brooks?" asked Director Thomas Chen, raising the question that had dominated private board discussions since her true identity was revealed. "How do we navigate the relationship with the majority owner who was victimized by our executive team?" The question was complicated by the unprecedented nature of the situation. No board of directors had ever faced the challenge of managing a corporation where the CEO had criminally assaulted the controlling shareholder. Corporate governance procedures didn't contemplate scenarios where criminal behavior created such fundamental conflicts of authority and legal liability. Miss Brooks has been remarkably professional given the circumstances, Sterling replied, consulting communications from Reginald Baxter about his client's intentions regarding corporate restructuring. Her legal team has indicated willingness to work with the board on organizational reforms, but only after complete accountability for the criminal behavior of current executive leadership. Director Gonzalez reviewed financial projections that showed how the discrimination scandal would impact Pinnacle's business relationships, client contracts, and market position. Our corporate partners are already distancing themselves from association with systematic racism. We're facing contract cancellations, boycotts, and investor flight that could force bankruptcy if we don't demonstrate immediate commitment to fundamental change. The board faced an impossible choice between protecting executives who had created criminal liability and preserving a corporation whose survival depended on demonstrating credible commitment to civil rights compliance. The systematic discrimination that had operated under their oversight was now threatening to destroy the business they had been elected to protect. The FBI investigation is expanding beyond individual criminal charges, Sterling announced, reading from federal court documents that outlined the scope of civil rights violations under investigation. Prosecutors are examining whether our corporate structure itself constitutes conspiracy to violate federal law through systematic discriminatory practices. As the emergency board meeting continued past midnight, directors who had once enjoyed the prestige and financial benefits of corporate governance found themselves facing criminal investigation, personal liability, and professional destruction. The discrimination culture they had enabled through passive oversight was now consuming the organization they had been trusted to protect. The system of cover-ups that had protected discriminatory practices for years was finally being dragged into the harsh light of federal investigation, media scrutiny, and public accountability. What executives had believed was acceptable corporate behavior was being revealed as criminal conspiracy that would result in the destruction of careers, reputations, and the corporate structure that had enabled systematic racism disguised as business professionalism. The next morning brought desperation to the executive floors of Pinnacle Industries, as Preston Hale, Preston Locke, and their co-conspirators faced the reality that their careers, reputations, and freedom were rapidly disappearing. In his corner office, Preston Hale frantically made phone calls to political contacts, legal specialists, and crisis management firms, searching for some way to escape the consequences of his documented assault and systematic discrimination. Senator Morrison's office says he can't take my call, Preston muttered to himself, staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. For 20 years, political connections had protected him from accountability for business practices that skirted legal boundaries. But federal civil rights violations involving viral video evidence had made him radioactive to politicians who once considered him a valuable donor and ally. Robert Chen entered the office with the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis, carrying legal documents that represented Preston's dwindling options for avoiding criminal prosecution and civil liability. Preston, I've spoken with every criminal defense attorney in the city who handles federal cases. They all say the same thing. The evidence is overwhelming. The publicity makes plea negotiations difficult, and your best option is complete cooperation with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Reduced charges? Preston's voice cracked with disbelief. Robert, this is all being blown out of proportion by liberal media and social justice activists. All I did was have a workplace disagreement with an employee who was acting inappropriately. Chen's laugh was bitter with legal reality. Preston, you physically assaulted the majority owner of this company while making racist statements that were recorded from 6 different angles. Federal prosecutors dream about cases this clear-cut. Your only choice is whether you want to spend 5 years in federal prison or 15 years. Down the hall, Preston Locke was having his own crisis as he realized that his loyal support for Preston Hale's discriminatory policies had made him a target for federal conspiracy charges. His personal attorney had explained that the emails he thought were private business communications were actually evidence of criminal coordination to violate civil rights law. I need to leave the country, Locke told his wife during a phone call that FBI surveillance equipment captured in real time. Maybe if I take a consulting position overseas, I can wait for this to blow over until people forget about it. Preston, his wife replied, her voice tight with fear and anger. You can't run away from federal criminal charges. You can't hide from the FBI in some foreign country like you're a drug dealer or a terrorist. But Locke had convinced himself that his situation was manageable through geographic distance and time. He began researching international business opportunities, consulting positions in non-extradition countries, and legal strategies for avoiding federal prosecution through strategic relocation. His research was interrupted by Agent Marcus Webb, who appeared in his office doorway with the kind of professional authority that made corporate executives understand why white-collar crime had serious consequences. Mr. Locke, I need to inform you that traveling outside the United States while under federal investigation constitutes flight risk that could result in immediate arrest and detention without bail. Locke's face went pale as he realized that his escape fantasies were actually additional criminal behaviors that would worsen his legal situation. I wasn't planning to leave the country. I was just exploring international business opportunities for the company. Webb's smile was sharp with law enforcement skepticism. Mr. Locke, your internet search history shows research into non-extradition treaties and countries without reciprocal law enforcement agreements. That's not international business development, that's flight planning. Meanwhile, David Kim was attempting a different strategy for avoiding accountability, destroying evidence that might link him to the discriminatory conspiracy. In his office, he frantically deleted emails, shredded documents, and attempted to wipe computer hard drives that contained communications about diversity management challenges. His efforts were interrupted by FBI computer specialists who had been monitoring the company's network in real time, watching executives attempt to obstruct justice through evidence destruction. Agent Sarah Martinez appeared in his doorway with search warrants and computer imaging equipment designed to recover deleted files. Mr. Kim, Martinez said, observing the shredded papers scattered around his desk. Destruction of evidence during a federal investigation is a felony that carries additional prison time beyond your civil rights conspiracy charges. Kim's hands shook as he realized that his attempts to avoid prosecution had actually created additional criminal liability. I was just cleaning up old files that weren't relevant to current business operations. According to our network monitoring, Martinez replied, consulting her tablet, you deleted 47 emails containing discussions about targeting minority employees just 15 minutes ago. You shredded personnel documents that showed discriminatory disciplinary patterns, and you attempted to wipe computer files that contained evidence of systematic bias in hiring and promotion decisions. The evidence destruction efforts were particularly damaging because they demonstrated consciousness of guilt that prosecutors would use to establish criminal intent. Executives who claimed their discriminatory behavior was inadvertent had simultaneously engaged in deliberate evidence destruction that proved they understood their actions were criminal. Preston Hale's panic reached a new level when his personal attorney informed him that federal prosecutors were considering additional charges based on the systematic discrimination patterns revealed through FBI investigation. Preston, they're looking at RICO conspiracy charges that could result in decades in federal prison. RICO? Preston's voice was weak with disbelief. That's for organized crime. That's for mafia bosses and drug cartels, not for business executives who had workplace management disagreements. RICO applies to any systematic criminal enterprise, his attorney explained patiently. When corporate executives coordinate to violate federal civil rights law through documented conspiracy, that falls under racketeering statutes that were designed to address systematic criminal behavior. The attorney's explanation was interrupted by Detective Nora Finley, who arrived with federal arrest warrants that transformed the executive suite into an active crime scene. Mr. Hale, you're under arrest for conspiracy to violate federal civil rights law, assault under federal statute, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. As federal agents placed Preston Hale in handcuffs, employees throughout Pinnacle Industries watched through office windows and recorded the arrest on smartphones that would soon share the footage across social media platforms. The man who had commanded corporate authority through intimidation and discrimination was being led away in custody like any other criminal. Preston Locke and David Kim received similar treatment as federal agents executed coordinated arrests that ensured none of the co-conspirators could warn others or destroy additional evidence. The executives who had believed their corporate positions insulated them from serious legal consequences were learning that federal civil rights law applies equally to everyone regardless of social status or professional authority. The federal courthouse steps became an impromptu stage for justice, as Isabella Cruz stood before a crowd of reporters, civil rights activists, and former Pinnacle Industries employees who had gathered to witness accountability for systematic workplace discrimination. At 34, Isabella had worked as a financial analyst at Pinnacle for 3 years before being terminated on fabricated performance issues after she complained about racist treatment from Preston Hale and his executive team. "For too long, we've been silent," Isabella said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had found courage through community support. "We've accepted termination rather than fighting back. We've signed non-disclosure agreements rather than exposing the truth. We've allowed these people to destroy our careers while pretending their racism was professional management." Behind her stood 12 other former Pinnacle employees, Black, Latino, and Asian Americans, who had been systematically excluded from promotion opportunities, subjected to discriminatory discipline, and ultimately forced out of their positions for challenging racist policies disguised as corporate standards. Marcus Williams, a former marketing director who had been terminated after questioning racially disparate promotion decisions, stepped forward to share his experience with the systematic discrimination that the FBI investigation had finally exposed. "Preston Hale told me that I was too aggressive in meetings, that I needed to tone down my communication style to fit the corporate culture. But when white colleagues spoke with identical assertiveness, they were praised for leadership potential." The press conference had been organized by Reginald Baxter as part of a comprehensive legal strategy that would use victim testimony to establish the scope of systematic discrimination at Pinnacle Industries. Each former employee represented years of documented bias that created a pattern of civil rights violations extending far beyond the assault captured on viral video. "They made us feel like we were crazy," said Jennifer Park, a former human resources specialist who had been fired after refusing to implement discriminatory hiring policies. "When you're the only person of color in a meeting, and everyone else thinks racist comments are normal business discussion, you start to question your own perceptions of reality." The testimony revealed how institutional racism operated through psychological manipulation that made victims doubt their own experiences while normalizing discriminatory treatment as corporate culture. Employees who complained about bias were labeled as troublemakers or not team players who failed to understand professional standards. Dr. Angela Thompson, a former research director who held a PhD in biochemistry from MIT, described how her qualifications were consistently questioned while less credentialed white colleagues were promoted to leadership positions. "Preston Locke told me that diversity initiatives sometimes put people in positions beyond their natural capabilities. He suggested I might be more comfortable in a support role that better matched my cultural background." The systematic nature of the discrimination became clear through witness testimony that revealed common patterns of racist treatment disguised as performance management. Minority employees were consistently subjected to additional scrutiny, held to higher standards, and excluded from informal networking opportunities that determine career advancement. "They documented everything we did wrong and nothing we did right," explained David Rodriguez, a former operations manager who had been terminated after 6 months despite exceeding all performance metrics. Meanwhile, white employees who made serious mistakes were given second chances and additional training opportunities. Reginald Baxter stepped forward to explain the legal significance of the testimony that former employees were providing to federal investigators. "What you're hearing today represents systematic civil rights violations that operated under the assumption that subtle racism was legally acceptable as long as it was expressed through corporate euphemisms. These former employees are heroes," Baxter continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting institutional discrimination. "They're speaking up despite non-disclosure agreements, despite career damage, despite personal risk, because they understand that silence enables the continuation of systematic abuse. The press conference was broadcast live across multiple news networks, with legal experts providing commentary about how victim testimony would strengthen federal prosecution of the Pinnacle Industries conspiracy. Civil rights organizations shared the footage across social media platforms, amplifying voices that had been silenced through corporate intimidation and legal manipulation. Isabella Cruz concluded her testimony by addressing other victims of workplace discrimination who were watching the press conference from offices where they continued to face similar treatment. To everyone who has been told that racism doesn't exist in modern corporate America, to everyone who has been gaslighted into thinking their experiences with discrimination were imaginary, to everyone who has been silenced by non-disclosure agreements and termination threats, we see you, we believe you, and we're fighting for you. The testimony created a wave of additional complaints, as employees from other corporations recognized similar patterns of discrimination in their own workplace experiences. Federal civil rights investigators received dozens of new complaints referencing the Pinnacle Industries case as a template for systematic racism disguised as business practices. "This is bigger than one company," explained Reverend Michael Thompson, who had joined the press conference to place the Pinnacle case in the broader context of institutional racism in corporate America. "What happened at Pinnacle Industries represents a culture of discrimination that operates in companies across the country, protected by legal strategies designed to silence victims and avoid accountability. The courage of former Pinnacle employees in speaking publicly despite legal risks inspired other victims of workplace discrimination to break their silence about systematic abuse." Social media platforms filled with testimonies from workers who had experienced similar treatment at other corporations, creating a movement of accountability that extended far beyond the original viral video. As the press conference concluded, Isabella Cruz and her fellow former employees stood together on the courthouse steps, no longer isolated victims of systematic discrimination, but powerful voices for change who had transformed their pain into a platform for justice. Their testimony had provided federal prosecutors with the evidence needed to pursue comprehensive civil rights charges, while inspiring other victims to demand accountability for institutional racism disguised as corporate professionalism. The people who had been humiliated, silenced, and discarded by Pinnacle Industries' discriminatory culture had finally found their voices, and their words would echo through courtrooms, corporate boardrooms, and workplace policies across the country. As America grappled with the systematic nature of institutional racism in professional environments, the federal courthouse in downtown had become a fortress of justice, as U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen prepared for what would become one of the most significant civil rights prosecutions in corporate America's recent history. Her team of federal prosecutors had spent 3 weeks reviewing the mountain of evidence that FBI investigators had compiled against Preston Hale and his co-conspirators, building a case that would set new precedents for accountability in workplace discrimination. "This isn't just about individual criminal behavior," Chen explained to her prosecution team during a strategy meeting in the secure conference room that had become their war room. "This is about sending a message that systematic racism in corporate America will face serious federal consequences regardless of the perpetrator's social status or economic power." The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its clarity. Surveillance footage captured Preston's assault from 6 different angles with crystal-clear audio. Email threads documented racist conspiracy spanning months of discriminatory planning. Personnel records revealed systematic disparities that violated federal employment law, and witness testimony from former employees established a pattern of institutional bias disguised as corporate professionalism. Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Thompson, who specialized in civil rights prosecutions, had never encountered a case where defendants had documented their own criminal conspiracy so comprehensively. Preston Hale's team created a paper trail of discriminatory animus that reads like a prosecution manual for civil rights violations. They recorded themselves planning systematic racism while believing they were having private business conversations. The prosecution strategy would demonstrate how individual prejudice had evolved into institutional discrimination through corporate policies that appeared neutral but functioned to exclude and diminish minority employees. Charts and graphs would show hiring disparities, promotion patterns, and disciplinary rates that revealed systematic bias operating under the cover of professional management. The victim testimony is particularly powerful, noted prosecutor Jennifer Martinez, reviewing statements from Isabella Cruz and her fellow former employees. These witnesses can establish how racist assumptions were translated into corporate policies that destroyed careers while maintaining plausible deniability. Meanwhile, in a downtown law firm that specialized in white-collar criminal defense, Preston Hale's legal team was grappling with the impossible challenge of defending actions captured on viral video and documented through comprehensive electronic evidence. Defense attorney Robert Morrison had handled hundreds of federal cases, but none where the evidence was so clear and the public outrage so intense. "Our only option is to minimize damages through plea negotiations," Morrison explained to Preston during a consultation that felt more like a sentencing hearing. "The assault is undeniable, the racist language is recorded, and the conspiracy evidence is overwhelming. Federal prosecutors hold every card in this case." Preston stared at the legal documents scattered across the conference table, still struggling to accept that his moment of rage had triggered a federal prosecution that would destroy everything he had spent his career building. "This is all politically motivated. Liberal prosecutors are using my case to advance their social justice agenda." Morrison's expression was grim, with legal reality. "Preston, you physically assaulted the majority owner of your company while making racist statements in front of dozens of witnesses. This isn't political prosecution. This is the inevitable consequence of criminal behavior that was too public and too clear to ignore." The defense team's research into potential strategies had yielded nothing but additional evidence of Preston's discriminatory beliefs and actions. Character witnesses were reluctant to testify on behalf of someone whose racism had been documented through viral video. Expert witnesses couldn't explain away assault footage or rationalize systematic discrimination patterns revealed through corporate records. "What about arguing that Ms. Brooks entrapped me by working undercover?" Preston asked desperately, searching for some legal theory that might provide protection from accountability. "Preston," Morrison replied patiently, "entrapment requires law enforcement to induce criminal behavior that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. Miss Brooks didn't make you grab her arm or push her against a wall while calling her racial epithets. She simply existed in a workplace, while black, and documented how you responded to her presence." The prosecution team, meanwhile, was preparing to present expert testimony about how institutional racism operates through policies and practices that appear neutral but create discriminatory outcomes. Angela Williams, a sociology professor who specialized in workplace discrimination, would explain how Preston's individual prejudice reflected broader patterns of systematic exclusion. The defendants will argue that their actions represented isolated incidents rather than systematic discrimination, Dr. Williams explained during trial preparation. But the evidence shows coordinated efforts to target minority employees through policies designed to maintain racial hierarchies while avoiding legal accountability. The expert testimony would contextualize Preston's assault within the framework of institutional racism that had operated at Pinnacle Industries for years. Individual incidents would be shown as symptoms of a discriminatory culture that encouraged bias while providing legal cover through procedural complexity. Federal prosecutors had also prepared comprehensive financial documentation showing how discrimination had operated as a business strategy rather than inadvertent bias. Settlement agreements revealed that corporate leadership had calculated that paying off victims was cheaper than changing discriminatory practices, treating civil rights violations as acceptable business expenses. They budgeted for discrimination, Prosecutor Thompson explained, reviewing financial records that showed systematic payments to former employees who had complained about racist treatment. They created accounting categories for civil rights settlements while continuing the policies that generated those legal liabilities. The prosecution's case would demonstrate how Preston Hale's assault represented the logical endpoint of systematic racism that had operated without accountability until federal investigation exposed the true scope of institutional discrimination. Individual criminal behavior would be shown as the inevitable result of corporate policies designed to exclude minority employees while maintaining legal plausibility. As trial preparation continued, both sides understood that the case would establish important precedents for how federal civil rights law applies to corporate discrimination in the digital age. Viral video evidence, systematic electronic documentation, and comprehensive witness testimony had created a perfect storm of accountability that would reshape how institutional racism is prosecuted under federal law. The community center in downtown had been transformed into a staging ground for justice. As civil rights activists, community leaders, and supporters of Nia Brooks gathered for a rally that would demonstrate public demand for accountability in the Pinnacle Industries case. Tomorrow's trial opening would mark a pivotal moment, not just for the defendants facing criminal prosecution, but for America's ongoing struggle with institutional racism in corporate environments. Reverend Michael Thompson took the podium with the gravitas of someone who had spent decades fighting for civil rights in courtrooms and communities across the nation. His voice carried the weight of history as he addressed the crowd of over 800 people who had come to bear witness to justice. Tomorrow morning, we will see whether America's promise of equal justice under law applies to corporate executives who believe their privilege protects them from accountability for racist violence. Thompson announced, his words echoing through the packed auditorium. We will see whether federal civil rights law has teeth when victims have video evidence and courage to demand justice. The crowd responded with passionate applause that reflected months of building outrage over systematic discrimination that had finally been exposed through Preston Hale's viral assault. Attendees held signs reading "Justice for Nia," "Corporate racism has consequences," and "No more cover-ups," that would soon appear on social media platforms, amplifying the demand for accountability. Isabella Cruz joined Thompson on the stage, representing the former Pinnacle employees whose courage in breaking non-disclosure agreements had provided crucial testimony for federal prosecution. Her presence symbolized the transformation of isolated victims into a powerful community demanding systemic change. "We're here tonight because silence enables abuse," Cruz said, her voice steady with the strength that comes from collective action. "We're here because corporate racism thrives in darkness, but dies in the light of public scrutiny. We're here because Preston Hale's violence was not an aberration, but the inevitable result of systematic discrimination that operates in companies across America." The rally had been organized by a coalition of civil rights groups, labor organizations, and community activists who understood that the Pinnacle Industries case represented an opportunity to establish important legal precedents for workplace discrimination prosecution. Local elected officials, religious leaders, and advocacy organizations had mobilized their networks to ensure strong public support for accountability. Dr. Angela Thompson, president of the local NAACP chapter, explained how the case connected to broader patterns of institutional racism that affected communities far beyond corporate boardrooms. When executives feel comfortable expressing racist beliefs and using physical violence to enforce racial hierarchies, they reveal the systematic nature of discrimination that destroys opportunities for our children and limits economic advancement for our communities. The crowd included family members of other workplace discrimination victims who saw the Pinnacle case as validation of their own experiences with systematic racism disguised as corporate professionalism. Many had endured similar treatment but lacked the video evidence and legal resources necessary to pursue federal prosecution. Tomorrow's trial is about more than one company or one assault, explained Maria Rodriguez, whose daughter had been terminated from a corporate position after complaining about discriminatory treatment. Tomorrow's trial is about whether America will finally hold corporate executives accountable for racism that has operated without consequences for too long. The emotional power of the rally was amplified by the presence of Nia Brooks herself, who appeared on stage to address the community that had rallied around her case. Wearing a simple black dress that emphasized her dignity rather than her wealth, she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had endured systematic abuse and chosen to fight back. I could have revealed my identity on the first day and stopped Preston Hale's harassment immediately, Nia said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. But individual protection doesn't address systematic problems. I chose to document the discrimination that operates when corporate executives believe no one important is watching. Her words reflected a strategic decision to endure months of racist abuse in order to expose the institutional nature of workplace discrimination. Rather than using her economic power to shield herself from bias, she had chosen to experience the treatment that other minority employees faced without protection. Tomorrow's trial will show America what corporate racism looks like when it's stripped of euphemisms and legal cover, Nia continued. Preston Hale's assault was captured on video, but the systematic discrimination that enabled his violence has been documented through months of evidence that reveals how institutional bias operates in professional environments. The crowd responded with sustained applause that reflected both admiration for her courage and determination to ensure that her sacrifice would result in meaningful change. Signs and banners waved throughout the auditorium as attendees prepared to maintain pressure for accountability throughout the trial proceedings. Community organizer James Patterson explained how the rally connected to broader movements for economic justice and civil rights that extended far beyond the Pinnacle Industries case. Corporate discrimination affects housing, education, healthcare, and economic opportunity in communities across America. When we hold Preston Hale accountable for racist violence, we're demanding accountability for systematic exclusion that limits opportunity for millions of Americans. The rally concluded with a call for sustained community engagement throughout the trial proceedings and beyond, ensuring that public pressure would continue regardless of individual case outcomes. Organizers had established communication networks that would coordinate courthouse demonstrations, media outreach, and legislative advocacy designed to translate this case into broader policy changes. As attendees filed out of the community center carrying signs that would appear at tomorrow's courthouse demonstration, the energy of collective action filled the streets surrounding the federal building, where justice would soon be delivered. The night before judgment had become a moment of community empowerment that transformed individual victimization into collective demand for systematic change. Police barriers were already being erected around the federal courthouse in preparation for the crowds expected to attend tomorrow's trial opening. Media trucks lined the surrounding streets as national news networks prepared comprehensive coverage of a case that had captured America's attention and would establish important precedents for civil rights prosecution in corporate environments. The night before judgment had become a community celebration of courage, dignity, and the possibility that America's promise of equal justice under law might finally extend to corporate boardrooms where systematic racism had operated without accountability for far too long. Judge Miriam Soto's federal courtroom was packed beyond capacity as the most anticipated civil rights trial of the decade began with opening statements that would define Preston Hale's fate and establish precedents for corporate accountability. The mahogany-paneled chamber buzzed with tension as prosecutors prepared to present video evidence that had already convinced millions of Americans that justice was long overdue. U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen rose to address the jury with the confidence of someone holding an unbeatable hand. Ladies and gentlemen, you will see 6 different camera angles of a corporate CEO physically assaulting the majority owner of his company while making racist statements about her right to exist in his building. The prosecution's opening was devastating in its simplicity. No complex legal theories, no procedural technicalities, just raw video evidence that spoke for itself. Chen played the assault footage on courtroom screens, watching jurors' faces register shock and disgust as Preston's violence unfolded in high definition. Defense attorney Robert Morrison faced an impossible task as he attempted to explain away video evidence that had gone viral across global social media. My client made serious errors in judgment under workplace stress. But this was not the systematic conspiracy that prosecutors are alleging. The defense crumbled within hours as prosecutor Marcus Thompson methodically presented emails, recordings, and witness testimony that revealed Preston's assault as the inevitable result of systematic racism. Isabella Cruz's testimony was particularly powerful, describing months of discrimination that had operated with impunity until federal investigation exposed the truth. Preston Hale told me I needed to understand my place in the corporate hierarchy. Cruz testified, her voice steady with dignity. He made it clear that minority employees existed in his building only through his benevolence. When the viral assault video played for the jury, several members visibly recoiled at Preston's racist language and physical violence. The defense had no response to evidence that spoke with undeniable clarity about character, intent, and criminal behavior. Preston sat at the defendant's table, watching his lies collapse under the weight of overwhelming evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with verdicts that would send shockwaves through corporate boardrooms across America. Judge Miriam Soto's courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood to deliver justice that had been months in the making. On the charge of conspiracy to violate federal civil rights law, we find the defendant, Preston Hale, guilty. On the charge of assault under federal statute, we find the defendant, Preston Hale, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant, Preston Hale, guilty. The guilty verdicts continued, as Preston Locke and David Kim received their own judgments for conspiracy and evidence destruction. The systematic nature of their discrimination had been exposed and condemned through the democratic process of trial by jury. Nia Brooks sat in the gallery with quiet dignity as justice was finally delivered. For months of racist abuse, her strategic decision to document systematic discrimination had resulted in federal prosecution that would establish important precedents for workplace accountability. Judge Soto's sentencing was swift and decisive. Mr. Hale, your actions represent a betrayal of the trust placed in corporate leadership. You used your position to perpetuate systematic racism while believing your privilege would protect you from consequences. This court sentences you to 7 years in federal prison. Preston Locke received 5 years for conspiracy, while David Kim was sentenced to 3 years for evidence destruction and conspiracy. The sentences sent a clear message that federal civil rights law would be enforced regardless of defendants' economic status or social connections. Outside the courthouse, Isabella Cruz addressed the celebrating crowd with words that would define the case's legacy. Today proves that courage has consequences, not just for those who speak truth, but for those who choose systematic racism over human dignity. You just witnessed resilience that refused to break. If this story deserves to be remembered, help us make sure it is. Subscribe, share, and let's keep these voices echoing for generations to come. Nia Brooks had transformed personal victimization into institutional accountability, ensuring that Preston Hale's moment of racist violence would result in federal precedents protecting workplace dignity for millions of Americans. Justice had been delivered through courage, preparation, and the unwavering belief that America's promise of equal protection under law must finally extend to corporate environments where systematic racism had operated without accountability for far too long.